Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about just because you can does not mean you should, and what that means from the perspective of brand friction between your brand and the consumer, and quite frankly, the small decisions that a lot of brands make along the way that often sometimes help or harm consumers. So let's get into this. I think it's fair to say that nobody sets out to damage their brand. I think that brands have the best intentions, bringing products and services to the marketplace, and I think that a lot of times they're trying to create products and services that actually help consumers. But I think once they kind of get into running their business, they're always trying to obviously increase revenue and decrease expenses. And sometimes those decisions, or I should say their objectives in doing so, might lead to unfavorable decisions because they might actually be making decisions that are creating more harm than good for their consumers and ultimately their brand. And it makes pretty good sense, right? I mean, the executive leaders can kind of make these decisions on the fly. More often than not, there's no consumer sitting at the table or inside that company kind of giving their voice, although some companies, I think the really good ones, will always think about including their customers through primary market research in the form of surveys or talking to them specifically, getting their feedback before they implement specific rules or changes or bring products and services to the market. And then, like I said, I mean, at the end of the day, businesses are always trying to increase revenue, become more profitable. So sometimes something that they have in place might actually cost them money, even though it's a benefit to the consumer. They might try to do away with it. I think that we're seeing this right now in the world of artificial intelligence. A lot of companies are moving to AI models, and we'll talk about that in the context of phone support as one of the examples that I provide soon. The main point is that, you don't lose a reputation in one move, you lose it in 100 small ones, right? It's sort of like death by 1,000 cuts. So I don't think you start out with the intent of kind of damaging your brand, but over time, if you make some unfavorable decisions, you and your team, you can definitely create some harm to your brand. And at the end of the day, you may not even know the harm that you're causing because consumers might just sort of take their business elsewhere. But let's break this down. So I'm going to give you 3 examples today. These are sort of 3 decisions that I felt, that seemed pretty reasonable, and we're going to peel back these examples, and they're in different industries altogether. Let's start with the first one. Healthcare, a hospital charging people to use the parking lot. This is a real world example. This is actually something that I personally experienced recently when I had a family member that was actually in the hospital. And, I actually use Kaiser, and Kaiser's been great. They've actually never charged me for parking, but I was really shocked, quite frankly, when I went to Providence Mission Hospital, and they're basically collecting tolls in the parking lot. Now, this is one of those situations where, and maybe we have difference of opinions, but let me share mine to give you some perspective. I think that the hospital is the worst place to be charging people a parking fee to, simply visit their family members or, to rush into the emergency room because a loved one's in there, whatever it might be. It is one of those things where I think, again, just because you can doesn't mean you should. I think that this does more damage to the brand. And quite frankly, in my own personal experience, I felt really taken back by this. And it wasn't so much the cost. The $5 is fairly nominal. But I think from the hospital's perspective, they see this as, wow, well, we have all these cars coming in and out, and we have this construction going around, the hospital. We could definitely take some of that revenue and apply it to the construction. I think that internally speaking, the team at Mission, that makes perfect sense. If you're staring at a spreadsheet and costs and you're thinking about how can we generate revenue, well, that's a great way. Charge people coming in and out. But if you were to invite consumers into that conversation, your people that attend the hospital, show up for their friends and family that are in, usually dire situations, chances are they're not going to be favorable with that. In fact, when I asked the parking attendant myself, I said, hey, do a lot of people complain about this? He's like, all day long, we're kind of getting yelled at. I mean, that proves my point, right? Consumers are upset. Why am I having to pay to park in a hospital parking lot? It's almost like insult to injury. You're going in, your family or your friends are in need, you feel terrible already. Sometimes you're grieving or you're concerned or you're stressed, and on the way out, you get hit with a toll. So again, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Let's get to the second one. venues and hospitality, pricing, right? So let's take a simple bottle of water for our story here today. So, I understand that obviously certain venues dictate certain levels of pricing. That makes pretty good sense. The problem is, again, that sometimes, even though you can raise your price, there is a balance to be struck before you're now kind of price gouging and you're kind of putting a bad taste in people's mouth. Like they want to go to the ballpark or they want to go to a venue and watch a concert or see this and see that. And something where a $3 bottle of water, which has plenty of profit margin for the vendor, now turns into, let's say, $6 or more just because you have a captive audience and they literally have no other place to go. It seems wrong. Again, to me, it feels like one of those things, just because you can, you probably shouldn't do it because it leaves an unfavorable perception amongst those people. And we've all been in that situation. I'm sure you and I have been to places where it's like, this is a ripoff. And I think that this is becoming a bigger problem, and we're starting to see this in more places than not. And I think it's leaving a bad taste in people's minds and probably even prompting some people not even to go out anymore. The third thing is the service and support. I know this has been going on for many years, which is removing the phone number, but it seems like it is really widespread now. In fact, it's really hard to get phone support anymore, especially now with artificial intelligence. Everybody is rushing to implement AI systems, which just exacerbates the issue, makes it even worse. I mean, if you go to most hotels, let's say in Vegas, a lot of them are implementing AI. You can't even speak to somebody at the front desk. Everybody in these companies are really pushing AI and pushing all this digital experience. But at the end of the day, when the customer needs you most, when they're in a tight situation or they just have a simple question, you have pushed them away and you have basically pushed them into a system that creates more friction, more frustration for things that might have just taken 5 minutes if you just staffed it with a live person. I know this has been going on for quite some time, but my point here is that it's almost getting worse. And again, it's another example of just because you can doesn't mean you should. So in the world of artificial intelligence, I would caution brands, definitely pick and choose where to implement the technology. But at the end of the day, don't create friction and distance between your customer. You want strong relationships. You want to have a connection between them and them. Don't make it difficult for them to do business with you. So what's the pattern, right? So really there's kind of three things here. Number one, it's a captive moment. You have no options. You have no choices. You can't go anywhere, right? So the customer, it's not like they can walk away. The second thing is it's a one-sided trade. It tends to benefit the business. It doesn't tend to benefit the consumer. I would encourage you, have the consumer as part of that conversation. Invite them in through primary market research, sample your customers, try to get some feedback and incorporate that into your decision-making process. And then number three, it's a cost nobody tracks. A lot of times brands are always going to just look at revenue, right? But the problem is you don't see what it's costing you behind the scenes. You don't see what it's costing you when somebody does have that poor experience, or like me personally, where I went to the hospital and now I'm going to tell a bunch of different people, like I'm sharing with you right now, that I had a terrible parking experience there where they tried to nickel and dime me to park in the parking lot to see a loved one, right? So brands can't always track all the unfavorable sentiment that is associated with some of their decisions. A lot of times it shows up much later on, maybe with the revenue declining, or it shows up with the reviews. But at the end of the day, if you have no mechanism of understanding what that true cost is, it is definitely going to hurt your brand. So really kind of three questions before you think about making some of these decisions internally, I would encourage you to do is say it out loud. Whatever that policy shift idea that you're thinking about doing in your organization, can you explain that in simple terms to one of your customers? And if you did, would they be, receiving that with open arms? Would they say, man, that's a great idea? Or would it be something where you kind of feel ashamed to tell them that you're going to basically remove the phone support and push them through a friction channel, right? Number two is kind of like, well, who pays? If you are not considering your consumer and the customer in the equation and thinking about them, putting yourself in their shoes, do they benefit from this? Do they have a better experience? Does it bring us closer with them? All of those things, then at the end of the day, it's a toll. You're basically making a decision that benefits you and has no benefit to them. And then number three is sort of like, well, what number would you put on getting that goodwill back? Because if you lose their trust and your brand slides downhill and you have these bad reviews and bad experience, I can promise you it's going to cost you twice as much, if not more, to regain their trust. If you had just avoided it in the beginning, you could have probably saved yourself a lot of time and money and a lot of frustration for your consumer. So just to kind of end it and wrap it all up, I believe can as a capability, should as a brand. And what I would encourage you to do is sort of find one policy, right? Work with your team and find one policy or one thing that your team is always apologizing for. And you can simply ask them, hey, based upon some of the feedback that you're getting from customers, whether it be in person or over the phone or digital, what's something that people complain about in interacting with our brand? Start there, because if they're having to apologize for something over and over again, that's a problem, right? That might be something that you can actually fix for them. And I'll wrap it up by saying, if you have any questions, you want to bounce some ideas off of me, please, I'm happy to help. You can DM me directly. You can reach out. My contact information is here. You can drop a comment below. And that's it for today. Take care.